Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is Monica Gallagher, a cartoonist whose webcomic, Bonnie and Clyde, has 2 strips that come out each week. Monica, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's get started talking about Bonnie and Clyde. We met in Charlotte and you told me the title of the comic and I was instantly hooked, and then over the past few days I've gone to your website, eatyourlipstick.com, and I've been binge reading the strips. You've got about 5 or 6 years of strips there.
Yeah, I started in 2009, I think. Yeah.
And it's an amazing development of the character and of your art style. So first off, why did you want to do this webcomic, and why as the web rather than trying to do some print?
It actually started, there was a contest in my local city paper. I live in Baltimore, so the Baltimore city paper was doing a contest for a new comic strip. And so I thought it would be fun to do it about roller girls because I had just watched my first roller derby bout and I was kind of inspired. So I created like 10 strips, and then it ended up not getting into the paper, but I liked it so much that I decided to keep going. And then as I did it, then I actually started skating and got into roller derby myself. And then I had a lot more material to work with after that.
So it's actually a matter of life imitating art.
Yeah, it was kind of funny that I didn't skate before I started. I started some not really knowing what it was, and then started skating.
So when I looked at the earlier strips, the art style was, I don't want to say this indelicately, but it was a cutesy style. There were a lot of, I guess it was almost a Disney style twinkle to some of the characters and your line work, and then your contemporary stuff, the stuff that you're coming out with now, the expressions are more expressive, I guess, but the style itself has changed. So I'm just wondering, as you look back from 2009 till now, or 2011 till now, when you look at your work, how do you view your progress?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, especially since you read it. If you read it all at once like that, it just transitions so fast. I think when I started it, I was trying for a little bit of like a Blondie retro comic strip feel. And then I think that just kind of went out the window the more that I did it. And then, yeah, lately, I don't know, it's kind of funny. I'm not exactly sure how it evolved, but I do try to draw it slightly differently from everything else I draw. So everything is still kind of like a little more simplified and a little more, like, I don't know, stripped down to the elements for a lot of the characters.
And you've got a great supporting cast. And you mentioned Blondie, and that's one of those strips that's in the newspaper. And it's the same characters over and over again, but they never really change, they never really adapt, they never really grow. It's always the big sandwich, it's always running into the postman. Whereas Bonnie has changed quite a bit from the beginning to where she is now, and some of your stories are heartbreaking. You've got Bonnie and her love interests, and I became emotionally invested in her relationship with Stuart, and I'm still waiting to see how this all works out. So your characters change and grow, and I'm just wondering if this is a conscious effort on your part, or is it just, stories are stories?
I think I started it trying to be the gag a week, or trying to just not have it exist in actual time. And then I kind of got bored with that because I did really like the characters, and they do kind of introduce themselves to you in weird ways. So I didn't even, like, there were certain things that I won't say because I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't read it, but I discovered things about the characters that I didn't know when I first created them. So it's kind of like the more you go into it, if they don't evolve, you don't really get to learn as much about them. So you kind of have to let them come out and tell you what they want to do. It's kind of weird.
Yeah, that is interesting because a lot of creators have mentioned this to me, that when they start writing something, it's at first just an idea, but then the creators take on their own voice. So about what point did you start to realize that Bonnie or Stuart or Fran or Herb, they had their own personalities and they were just telling the story through your hand?
For Bonnie, it was pretty quick, and then for Herb, it was really quick. I just realized immediately who he was and what he was like. It's no problem at all for some reason for me to imagine what it's like to be a middle-aged gay werewolf. It's easy. It was harder for some of the other characters, and I had to stop myself because I realized that I was writing them all in my voice. And so, and I still do that occasionally, and I have to kind of step back and remind myself, like, this character, sometimes I write down like 3 or 4 traits to remind myself, and then write it in their voice so that I don't get stuck making everybody the same. Because some of the characters didn't start off as fully fledged.
So We start off with Bonnie sort of always being upbeat, and in recent strips you soften that, where she seems to be having some self-doubts and some growth, and really I think that's a great thing, and I really have been enjoying reading the strip. So as you're writing this, do you have a plan in mind, or is it just, I'm just going to sit down and see what their lives are like today as I sit at the drawing board?
Well, the way I do this strip, it's different because when you do, a regular graphic novel or a longer form comic, you can write one draft and go back and edit it and then edit it again. But with this, it's almost like you have to plan certain strips out far in advance and then keep revising them as you get closer and closer to them. Because I've planned certain things to happen, and then as I get closer, sometimes I scrap whole storylines because the characters have changed in ways that I didn't expect. So yeah, there are certain things that I have planned, but then they always change depending on what the character actually wants to do. I've tried to force some things and they just don't let me. Or I've had to switch who it happened to even because it just didn't work out. So it's kind of weird.
So you originally had worked on this strip for a newspaper. So when you were a kid growing up, what were the comics that you wanted to read in the newspaper? I know for me it was always, Peanuts and Blondie and For Better or For Worse. So what were you looking at and getting inspired by?
Well, Garfield and Calvin and Hobbes were kind of the biggest, but I went through this phase growing up where I remember I read every single comic in the newspaper. Like I would make myself read them. Even like Prince Valiant and like Spider-Man and Apartment 3G, which nothing ever happened. But I felt like it was my duty to read all of them.
Even Mary Worth?
Even Mary Worth, yeah. Well, I don't know. We didn't have, because when we would visit my family in Michigan, they'd have different comics. Like we never had Luann in our comics, but they had it in theirs, and I was always excited to catch up when I visited families, see what Luann was up to.
I grew up in New York, and we had multiple papers. So depending on, if Grandma and Grandpa came by, you got to read the Daily News funnies, and they were different than Newsday's funnies, the paper we subscribed to. So it was just this glorious world on a Sunday.
Yeah, Sunday was the best, obviously, because you had all of the comics to choose from.
Now you've done a few Bonnie and Clydes in color. So is there any difference in your approach when you're working black and white as opposed to when you're adding the layers of color?
Yeah, color takes me a really long time. I'm not very fast at it. And my first webcomic that I did, I started in 2000, and then I actually ended it just last year or the year before, it was called Gods and Undergrads, and it was this really long epic, and it was all color for the first 2 books, I think. And then I just couldn't put it out unless I switched to black and white, and I felt so guilty about it. But it was just, I don't know what I was thinking, like immediately doing an epic and then immediately doing it in color. It was just... So now it's hard for me to convince myself to go back to color because I feel like it takes me a lot longer than professional colorists, and it doesn't look as good as it justifies that time that I spend on it.
I guess we're always our harshest critics when it comes to artwork. I know when I sit down at the drawing board, if I don't practice long enough at something, I'm just going to hate the way something looks, or I'm not telling a story well. And most of my work is in black and white because for the love of God, I have no idea what color is supposed to look like.
Right.
So working black and white can also be, very freeing. So now you've done some work for Oni as well. Now, was that in color or black and white?
My first story for them was colored by somebody else, so that was kind of a relief. And then that was just a short story in a Derby anthology they had. And then my first graphic novel was grayscale. And grayscale is kind of like a comfort zone because then strict black and white was harder for me. But if I had like a range of grays, I could just, shade in all the problems and distract people. And then so that was for the book Glitter Kiss that I illustrated that was written by Adrian Ambrose. And then the second book that I worked on with Oni, Part-Time Princesses, I did everything just stark black and white. And it was a bit harder because it challenged me because I tend to be really lazy with backgrounds. And I had to be kind of more creative. It's still like when I look at it, I still cringe, but that's what's going to happen with everything.
Right. Backgrounds are the bane of my existence as well, and it's always difficult trying to figure out where to place the black, basically, to make sure that it has the right weight and everything like that. Now, did you study art in college, or is this just something that came to you naturally?
Yeah, in high school, I went to a special art school magnet program for my senior year. And then in college, I studied animation. So it was different, but it was kind of nice because we didn't have any fine art classes, but we did photography and film, and then 2D animation and cell animation as well as 3D animation. So that was really cool. It was kind of a natural evolution for me to get into comics. I had been doing comics in high school, but this was kind of a faster way just to, just do a storyboard. And then you don't actually have to make the animation. You can just take the storyboard and make it a comic. Yeah.
So your work for Oni, that's a traditional comic book style presentation, isn't it?
I think they probably have some people working digitally now.
But I mean, it's done sequential art over like, a 10 by 15 page where you're doing more than just the 4 panels that you're doing with Bonnie and Collide.
Yeah, definitely. Bonnie is more of like a newspaper strip that's just the 4 panels. Yeah, so Oni is definitely, they have like manga size, but full page.
So when you're working that way as opposed to working with the 4 panels, how is that challenging to you as an artist, and how are you thinking about storytelling on that page when you've got so much more room to play with?
It is interesting, and it took me a while to realize that I had the responsibility to think of every page as a new layout and a new composition. And that Will Eisner book, I think might have just been sequential art or something. He has a really great book about like every page and treating it visually how you want the narrative to flow and keeping that in mind. And so I do consider that now, and it takes a lot longer to do a full page. Sometimes I get lazy with Bonnie, and it's like all words like packed in there that I want to tell, and very like little faces peeking out. But with a full page, it's harder because you really have to give people a lot more space and time to think about it and to read. They can't just like zip across.
And when you're working on, I guess, the traditional comic book style page, are you considering, I guess you are considering the way the balloons are placed and everything else? Because like you said, in Bonnie, you'll have more of the story, but I think it works in Bonnie because it's this epic at this point. It's almost like this never-ending novel that frankly shouldn't end. And you're trying to tell all that story in 4 pages, but on a full page, it seems like you'd have a little bit more space to work with, and I'm guessing that kind of factors into your decision making.
Yeah, it does. And the lettering is interesting. I haven't figured that out exactly because when I've worked on professional books, they have their own letterer, and I try to make room for them, and then they usually end up putting the balloons elsewhere. And so it's usually because they have their own method that I may not understand. So it's kind of funny trying to find that balance of like, I don't know, where I assume that like, but I do like weird bubbles that cross, and they have all these laws against stuff like that that I really need to study up on, so I don't make their work harder for them.
Now let's talk about the books that you do for yourself, because when you work for Oni, they're paying you, and God bless. But when you're doing Bonnie, you're doing this for yourself, really. So how do you find the time, first off, to do this? Because here we are, we're taping this later than we normally tape this. You're just getting back from work.
Sorry, guys.
I know what it's like working Monday through Friday and then getting home and then trying to find the time to do something creative and giving yourself that deadline. So how do you find I guess the discipline to come out with 2 strips a week?
It's a lot easier now than it was. I think about 7 years ago, I switched to working 24 hours a week at my day job. And before that, I had switched to 32 hours a week. So I'm gradually kind of stepping down, even though they told me like I can't just go down to like 8 hours. They wouldn't let me do that. But I used to work full time and do my full color webcomic too. And it was just because I don't know if it was college or what happened, but I was just used to working and then working on creative stuff when I got home. There was no just zone out in front of the TV and do nothing. It was, you're just always working. And now that's a good thing and a bad thing, because I think a lot of us, especially like full-time comics people, they don't know when to stop because there's always more that you could do. So it's really hard to kind of give yourself a break and schedule your time and stuff like that, and not just be like, I would love to do Bonnie like 5 days a week, but I might kill myself.
Yeah, because at some point you do have to go out and get groceries and get the mail and that sort of stuff. Just doesn't arrive in your house, I've discovered, as I've reached adultivity. So for the average Bonnie strip, how long are you spending on each page?
I think it takes me about 2 to 3 hours, because now I got a large format printer, so I can print out all the lines and borders, which is great. And then it doesn't take me too long, and this is just once I've already written it, because I have an app called Workflowy that's like a list making app, and so I'll like for months or weeks or however long before I'll be putting in dialogue and readjusting it and editing it, and then when it comes time to put it in the script, I pretty much don't have to do any editing at that stage. I can just pencil and ink it, and then on the computer, I replace all of my word balloons that I drew with computerized ones from a font that I made for my handwriting.
Oh, wow.
So that it looks slightly neater. And so it takes like, yeah, maybe an hour to 2 hours to pencil and ink, and then probably another hour to computerize it, depending on how much I messed up when I drew it.
Right. So I was looking on your website, eatyourlipstick.com, and I have the hardest time saying that name. I always want to say eat my lipstick.
It was a bad idea to do that.
But the question I have is, it looks like you use the traditional methods where it's you're using like the blue line pencil and then you're just doing inks over that. So are you using like India ink and a brush, or are you using the Copic markers or something along those lines?
I use the Pentel Pocket Brush Pen, and it has refillable cartridges you put in, and that's a pretty good a good line. And then for like really thin lines, I use the Pigma Sensei brand of pens, and that's so mainly everything is with a brush pen. I used to use the India ink with a brush, and I loved it, but I would have to wash my brush after every page. I don't know how people do it. It would take me forever. So. Do you do that?
I've switched over to the Copic markers because what I realized was I couldn't get India ink as dark as I could in the 80s. And I didn't want to go over the same line 8 times just to get it because I lost the spontaneity. So I went to the Copic because they were refillable, and I've been having pretty good success with them. I'm happy about that. But what I find is when I get home, I have all my obligations, and on top of that, no one reads my web strip anyway. So I've got that going for me.
You can't have that attitude about it. You have to like pretend. I used to every time I posted my comic, even when no one was reading it, I would like talk to my imaginary audience.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to get into. Was, I mean, how did you begin your brand and start talking to people? Because you're on a Patreon. You've got people who will sponsor you. So could you explain a little bit how you were able to do that?
Yeah, I saw a lot of other fellow cartoonists doing it. And Patreon, for people who don't know, is kind of a way to directly support artists. And it really helps webcomicers, especially because if you don't have a bunch of ads on your site paying for it, it helps to have something where people just like give you $1 every month or whatever. Because most people, I always feel guilty sometimes about not posting enough stuff just for them, but they all just say, you know, we just want to support you because you're putting the strip up for free all the time. So it's such a nice way to get like instant feedback and get a community. And I know a lot more cartoonists who are more active on it, and so they have a lot more income from that because they're really good about really making it their own little community. And I haven't really gotten to that part yet, but I'd like to.
Now, I notice on your site, people comment on strips. They have their favorite characters, and you try and interact with them. So just on an average week, how much time are you spending kind of curating your site?
Not that much. I don't get too many comments unless I do something really radical in the strip. And usually I feel like it's not my business to talk to them. Like it's their community, the readers. And so I don't want to interfere with what they think, but then sometimes I can't help myself. There's this one guy who, he's one of my biggest fans because he comments on almost every strip, and it was funny, for the longest time he hated Stuart. And Stuart was like the nicest character in the world. And every time I put him up, this guy would comment and be like, oh, this guy again, what a jerk. And it was so funny.
It's great too, when I'm reading the strip, you have themes that come up. Bonnie has a love of fall. And there's always something that's happening in fall. And then there's Herb, the gay werewolf, which is just another great thing when everyone's afraid of him, but then he goes home and he's just this hipster who's enjoying a nice Chardonnay or something like that. So when you're putting these characters together, are you kind of thinking about poking fun at certain aspects of society, or is it just something where, you know, hey, they're just characters and take it for what it is?
I'm sure they're all influenced by different people in my life and my own interests, like different sides that I find interesting. Sometimes I worry that they won't be diverse enough because I pull too much from my own particular viewpoint of the world. Yeah, sometimes I do use them to comment. Like some of the coworkers, I think I mimicked mimicking basically coworkers that I've interacted with and their views and how bizarre they are, how bizarre their workplace behavior is.
And there's always a feeling in this that at any moment something is going to go wrong, because Bonnie is always this optimistic character, but everything around her is really telling her that she might not want to be optimistic all the time. Maybe she wants to hedge her bets. Is this, in your mind, something that Bonnie is aware of, or is this just, again, just take it for what it is, stupid?
I think early on I decided that her whole thing would be because she does roller derby, she gets out all of her aggression. So everything else that she has to give to the world is just pure optimism and pure excitement and pure joy because she doesn't have any like pent up rage. She gets it out in a really healthy way. But of course, people are always going to try to kind of like bring her down, and she is going to have to be upset about stuff. So it'll be interesting to see, because I've already delved into it a little bit and some people were disappointed that she didn't stay the same. But I'd like her to grow while still like retaining some of her core values, like how excited she is about everything.
It's interesting because we see that it starts off where Bonnie is married to Derby, basically, but in recent strips, we don't see Derby as much, so it seems like that has become less of an important element of the universe that you've created. Again, is this something simply because the characters have these unique lives, or is it something that you've consciously said, well, I'd like to look in a different direction, maybe I've told all the stories that I can tell?
Yeah, it is difficult because I was only in Derby for a year and a half, so I feel like my experience is limited to a degree. But then I do really like the characters, and I feel like there's so much that I can do with them. So it's kind of a balance of how much Derby, because it's always going to be Derby is always going to be there, but how much Derby should I have interact with them, or does it just get in the way of their development? There has to be. I used to do it. I used to just plan my strip around like Bonnie relationships, Derby, and then work, and then like try to balance and make sure I hit all three areas. But then the characters just, I always like writing people more than events, I think, so.
And then you started combining the worlds of Bonnie, where the Derby folks are going to work, meet the work folks, and then all of the strange relationships, and it's a fun ride. And I feel like I'm talking so much about this strip because that's probably it's the work I'm the most familiar with. But your other work has gotten attention. I believe you were mentioned in an NPR book review recently.
Yeah, that was great. It was actually Bonnie that the interviewer found. She found it in a comic shop in Chicago, I think. So that was super exciting.
And then your Oni book wasn't it nominated for an award as well?
Yeah, I think Glitter Kiss and Part-Time Princesses were nominated for this, what they call a YASLA. It's the Young Adult, I don't remember what the rest of it stands for, Young Adult SLA Library Association. I don't remember. But it was great. Yeah, it was awesome. It was basically librarians were picking books that they liked and nominating them, and that's huge. If you can get the librarians to like your stuff, that's such a compliment. So.
It seems like the young adult market is really where we seem to be getting the most interesting fiction these days, whether it's Harry Potter or The Hunger Games or 50 Shades of Grey. So is this a market that you're conscious of when you're coming up with ideas and thinking, well, I could work in this market, or is it just your stories happen to fit that group?
It's kind of interesting because basically anytime I pitch to a publisher, they're always asking for young adult. So you're kind of stuck always pitching a certain age group. But I know that kids like to read older than they are. So you can kind of, even when they say it's young adult, you can actually put a lot of adult stuff in there. And they'd rather read that than something tailored younger to them or to the younger than them. But that's why I like doing Bonnie too, because I really want more adults to read comics. I feel like kids and teens and young adults are doing well. Like they already know that comics are great, but a lot of adults still don't get it. So I would like to find a way to still get more age groups older into comics.
Now I see that we have just a few minutes left. And what I wanted to ask you about was how you were taking your web strip. You've printed out, you personally, but you've had a couple of editions of Bonnie printed. And I was wondering how you went about that. So in the future, if someone is watching the program and wants to get their own comic on actual paper, how could they go about doing something like you've done?
Yeah, it's really easy for Bonnie because it was a horizontal strip. I actually printed it myself for a couple of years on 8.5 by 11 paper. So it was horizontal and then just folded it in half. And so I would just print it out on my printer, and then I got a long neck stapler and made little mini comics that way. And I used to do that for, I don't know, the first 10 issues or something of Bonnie. And then just last year, I did a Kickstarter to collect it into like an actual real book that I wouldn't be able to print on my own. So yeah, I mean, anyone out there, if you don't have a printer, you can always go to Kinko's. And then there's so many digital printers now that are really great about doing like really cheap prints. Like I have a local printer now who does all of my mini comics because they're basically like brochures to him, and he can do them a lot faster than I ever could. So.
And it's also interesting, I guess, because you're so computer savvy, that it's easy for you to prep something for print. You don't have to go to a designer or someone who's going to help you lay something out in InDesign. You can just figure that out yourself and then send them a file. You don't have to go there with a hard copy that they need to photograph and make a plate up and everything else.
Yeah, it's kind of, I mean, I laugh because it takes me a long time. When I laid out my book to send to the printers, the Bonnie book, I had to work in InDesign for the first time, and I paid basically like $350 in errors because I would send them something and then have to redo it, and they'd make me pay for it. It's like, this is my tuition to the school of life. Like, so it's definitely trial and error. It doesn't come easily to a lot of us. So.
Now I see that we have about a minute left. Usually at this time I like to tell our viewers how they can find out more about you. So your website is eatyourlipstick.com, and when they go there, not only can they find Bonnie, but they can find links, I guess, to buy your products.
Yeah, I have a bunch of mini comics, and then I also have, I think I have some comics online there too that they could just read directly from my site. And then I have an art portfolio for just like illustration work, and a blog where I occasionally post stuff. And then it links to my Twitter and my Instagram and everything like that.
Well, Monica, they're telling me that our time is up, and I'd like to thank you so much for talking with us today.
Yeah, thank you.
And I'd like to thank you at home for watching Comic Culture. We hope to see you again soon.